July 21, 1973. Hong Kong, 6:43 in the morning. The phone call that reached Raymond Chow at his home came before 7. The person who made it spoke for less than a minute. Chow dressed quickly, told no one where he was going, and drove to the apartment on Cumberland Road himself. By the time he arrived, the situation had already become something that could not be managed, only contained. Bruce Lee was dead. The woman who had been present when it happened was sitting in the front room in a state that the word distressed does not come close to describing. And what she knew, the specific sequence of events in the hours between Bruce Lee lying down with a headache and the ambulance arriving to find him already gone, she would carry inside her for the rest of her life without ever giving a single interview about it. Her name was Betty Ting Pei. And the remarkable thing, actually let me be more precise about this because remarkable is too easy a word for something this specific. The thing that took me a long time to sit with when I started digging into this story is not that she stayed silent. People stay silent for all kinds of understandable reasons. What took me a long time to sit with is the quality of the silence, the shape of it, the fact that it held for decades in an environment, Hong Kong celebrity culture, the film industry of the 1970s, where silence of that kind costs something real, where maintaining it requires either extraordinary discipline or extraordinary fear, or some combination of the two that I cannot fully separate from the outside. What I want to do in the next 30 minutes is not tell you what happened in that apartment. I cannot do that. No one can, because the only person who was present through the entire sequence of events chose not to become a source. What I want to do instead is investigate around the silence. Look at what we can verify, what the documented record shows, where the accounts from other witnesses begin and end, and try to understand, as honestly as I can, what the silence itself might mean. Betty Ting Pei was 26 years old in July 1973. She had come to Hong Kong from Taiwan in the late 1960s, part of a wave of Taiwanese actresses making their way into the Hong Kong film industry during the period when Golden Harvest had broken from the Shaw Brothers structure, and the industry was expanding fast enough to absorb new talent at a pace it never had before. She was working. She had a career. She was, by the accounts of people who knew her in this period, ambitious in the specific way that young women working in Hong Kong cinema in the early 1970s had to be ambitious, carefully, with full awareness of the specific economics of the industry they were operating inside, which rewarded beauty and availability in ways that had nothing to do with talent. The Hong Kong film world of 1971 to 1973 was not an environment that treated its female participants with any particular care. The infrastructure was commercial and fast-moving. Golden Harvest Studios on Hammer Hill Road in Kowloon operated with the energy of an industry at the moment of its own breakthrough. Multiple productions running simultaneously on adjacent sound stages, Cantonese and English mixing mid-sentence in hallways, dim sum carts rolling through between equipment setups, the temperature in summer pushing above 35 degrees on sets with no cooling. The harbor smell, salt and diesel and dried fish, found its way into everything near the water. It was a world that moved fast and remembered slowly, and young actresses operating inside it understood that their professional standing was contingent on relationships they could not always choose. Betty Ting Pei's relationship with Bruce Lee was known to people inside the industry. It was not publicized. The specific nature of it has been characterized in different ways by different people who were adjacent to it. Some carefully, some less so. And what I can tell you with confidence is that the characterizations are not consistent with each other, and that the person at the center of them has never offered her own. Bruce Lee died on July 20th, 1973. He was 32 years old. The official cause was cerebral edema, swelling of the brain, attributed to a reaction to meprobamate, an ingredient in a painkiller called Equagesic that he had taken that afternoon for a headache. This is documented. The coroner's inquest established it. The timeline, as it was publicly established, placed him at Betty Ting Pei's apartment on Cumberland Road in the afternoon of July 20th for a meeting related to a film project. He complained of a headache. She gave him Equagesic, her own prescription. He went to lie down in her bedroom. She checked on him. He could not be woken. She called Raymond Chow. Chow arrived. They called a doctor. By the time the doctor arrived, Bruce Lee was unresponsive. An ambulance took him to Queen Elizabeth Hospital. He was pronounced dead on arrival or shortly after. The accounts vary slightly on this specific point. That is the official version. It is the version supported by the coroner's inquest and by the public statements made at the time. Here is where I want to be honest with you about the limits of what I can tell you, because they are real limits and they matter. The official version establishes a sequence of events. It establishes a cause. What it does not establish, what no public account has ever established, because the one person who could establish it did not speak, is the texture of those hours. What Bruce Lee said when he arrived, what his condition was, whether anything in the hours preceding his collapse was different from other days, other visits, other afternoons in that apartment, whether Betty Ting Pei, in the time between his lying down and her inability to wake him, understood that something was seriously wrong before she understood that it was catastrophically wrong. What she did in that time, what she thought. These are not small questions. They are not idle ones. They sit at the center of any serious attempt to understand what happened to Bruce Lee on July 20th, 1973, and they remain, 50 years later, unanswered. I want to stop here for a moment and tell you something honestly about what this investigation felt like. The further I went into it, the less comfortable I became. Not with the story, but with my own assumptions about why the silence existed. My initial instinct, when I started this, was that the silence was about self-protection, legal exposure, reputational damage, the specific vulnerability of a young Taiwanese actress in 1973 Hong Kong who had been present at the death of the most famous man in the Chinese-speaking world. Those were real pressures. I don't dismiss them. But the more I looked at how the silence held, across decades, across the transformation of Hong Kong cinema, across a career that continued and then faded, and then became a footnote, the more I started to wonder if what I was reading as strategy was something else entirely, something more private and more painful than calculation. I'm not certain. I want to be clear that I am not certain. But I stopped being comfortable with the simple version a long time ago. The inquest into Bruce Lee's death concluded in September 1973. The verdict was death by misadventure, accidental death as a result of an adverse reaction to a medication. Betty Ting Pei gave testimony. That testimony is part of the public record. It established the basic sequence I described earlier. It was, by all accounts, consistent and composed, which is a thing I have thought about more than once. To sit in a coroner's inquest 2 months after what she had experienced in that apartment and give testimony that was consistent and composed. Whatever she was carrying by that point, she was carrying it without visible collapse. The testimony she gave is the last time she spoke publicly about the events of July 20th in any form that entered the permanent record. After the inquest, the requests came. Journalists, documentary makers, researchers, people who had been adjacent to the story and wanted to fill in the parts the official record left empty. Over the decades that followed, and we are talking about 50 years of requests, some made through intermediaries, some directly, some with what I can only assume were significant financial incentives attached, she declined all of them. Every single one. I want to ask you something here, and I mean this as a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. When you sit with that, 50 years of silence, maintained completely, in a media environment that has become progressively more aggressive in its pursuit of this specific story, what does that read as to you? Because there are two dominant interpretations, and I have spent a long time unable to fully commit to either one. The first is that the silence is protective, that she made an early decision about what she would and would not carry publicly, and she held to it with a discipline that, whatever you think of the circumstances, represents something real. The second is that the silence is the weight of something she cannot put down without destroying something she has spent 50 years keeping intact. I genuinely do not know which of those is true. I'm not sure they're mutually exclusive. Tell me what you think. Leave it below. I will read it, because this is exactly the kind of question I don't want to sit with alone. What the documentary record does tell us, the parts that exist outside of Betty Ting Pei's account, is this. The people who were first to arrive at the apartment after Raymond Chow were operating in an environment of extraordinary pressure. Bruce Lee was the most commercially valuable figure in Hong Kong cinema at the precise moment of maximum commercial momentum. Enter the Dragon had been shot. It had not yet been released. The Warner Brothers relationship was intact. Everything he had spent a decade building was days away from arriving in a form the whole world would see. The people managing that, at Golden Harvest in the Warner Brothers relationship, had interests that were not identical to the interests of historical clarity. I am not suggesting a conspiracy. I want to be precise about this. What I am suggesting is that in the immediate aftermath of July 20th, 1973, there were people with significant financial and professional stakes in the management of information, and that Betty Ting Pei was the person sitting at the center of all of it, and that the decision she made to give formal testimony to the coroner, to establish the official sequence, and then to say nothing further to anyone, ever, was made in that specific environment. What that environment communicated to her, explicitly or otherwise, about what she should and should not say, I don't know. I have not found anything that documents it directly. What I have found is the shape of a situation in which a young woman with limited institutional power was surrounded by people with significant institutional interests, and that the outcome of that situation was a silence that is held for half a century. There is a detail in the record from this period that I keep returning to, and I cannot tell you with certainty what it means, but I cannot leave it out either. In the weeks following Bruce Lee's death, before the coroner's inquest, Raymond Chow gave a series of press statements. The statements were carefully worded. They established the official sequence. They were consistent with what Betty Ting Pei would later testify. But there is one element of the early statements that shifted slightly between the first account and the later ones, a detail about the timing of certain phone calls made from the apartment that afternoon. The shift is not dramatic. It is the kind of shift that could easily be attributed to the confusion of a difficult situation remembered imperfectly. But it is there, in the record, for anyone who looks carefully enough. Whether that shift has any significance, whether it connects to anything Betty Ting Pei might have said if she had spoken, I cannot tell you. It is one of the things that has no clean resolution, and I am not going to manufacture one. Bruce Lee believed that a goal is not always meant to be reached, that it often serves simply as something to aim at. He wrote that. He meant it philosophically, about the process of becoming rather than the arrival. But sitting with this story for the time I've spent with it, I found myself thinking about it differently, about what it means to live with something you cannot fully articulate, about what it costs to carry the weight of an unanswerable question for 50 years, not as a lesson about resilience, as a human fact about a specific woman who was 26 years old in a bedroom in Hong Kong when the most famous man in her world stopped breathing, and who has never, in the half-century since, told anyone exactly what that was like. Betty Ting Pei continued working in Hong Kong cinema through the 1970s. Her career was complicated by the events of 1973 in ways that the industry's treatment of her makes uncomfortable reading. She became, in certain narratives, a figure of blame, the person in whose apartment it happened, as if her proximity to the death made her its cause. This is a specific kind of unfairness that has a long history in how industries treat women who are present at moments of male catastrophe, and I do not want to pass over it without naming it directly. She stepped back from public life gradually. The requests for interviews continued. The silence continued. There are accounts from people who knew her in later years that describe someone who was, by any external measure, living a life, not destroyed, not in permanent public crisis, but carrying something private in a way that the people around her could sense without being able to fully describe. That is the shape of what the evidence gives us. The interior of it, what she actually knows, what she actually experienced, what she has actually been living with, belongs entirely to her, and she has decided with a consistency that I have come to genuinely respect, even as it frustrates every instinct I have as a researcher, that it will stay there. The night Bruce Lee died, the harbor outside Hong Kong smelled of salt and diesel and the particular heat of a July that was not finished yet. Somewhere across the water, in the editing rooms where Enter the Dragon was being assembled for a release he would never see, the film that was about to make him the thing he had spent his entire life trying to become was taking its final shape. He had never seen it finished. He never would. In an apartment on Cumberland Road, a 26-year-old woman sat in a front room and waited for the people who were going to arrive and tell her what came next. Whatever she decided in that waiting, about what she would say, about what she would keep, about the specific shape her silence would take, she made it then, in that room, before anyone had told her what was expected of her. And she has kept it ever since, not because the story doesn't matter. It clearly does, to the millions of people who have spent 50 years asking about it, but because some things that happen in a room between two people, one of them living and one of them gone, belong to the one who is still here. That might be the most honest thing I can tell you about this story. The absence at the center of it is not an accident or a cover-up or a mystery waiting to be solved. It is a decision made by a person with every right to make it, and it has held